He's been here before. He knows how to play this game. Welcome to the Owl's Head Transportation Museum. We're very excited to let you know that as of last night at the National Association of Automobile Museums, you are now sitting in an award-winning exhibition. The museum took second place with the NAMS for exhibition design. We took first place in publications with our strut and axle, which all of our members receive 4 times a year. And we took first place with our website's redesign, so we're very excited. We welcome you to this award-winning exhibition. We hope you have been enjoying it and will continue to enjoy it through its duration. Thank you. Now, for those of you who have been here before, you'll recognize this bit. At the back of the room, at the table, we have a membership raffle drawing. If you sign your name and give us a little bit of information, you will be entered into the raffle. If you're already a member of the museum, it's transferable, or we can hold on to it and you can roll it into 2016. It makes a wonderful gift, though. And at the end of the program, I encourage you to stop back by that table and fill out a brief questionnaire. It's just an evaluation that lets us know what you thought of today's program, but it will also give us some insight as to what you would like to hear in future iterations of this program. We're now in our 16th season. We have one more presentation after this. We'll be joined by Charlie Vincent and Jack Churchill, who will be addressing motorcycle racing on the Isle of Man, both road and off-road trials racing. Charlie Vincent is actually a gold medal 6-day trials winner from the 60s and 70s, so we're very lucky to have him and a couple of his award-winning bikes on display at the museum for that presentation. I hope most of you know by now that we did have Dick Berggren scheduled to present today. Dick is being inducted into the Maine Motorsports Hall of Fame. I believe it's next weekend. He lives in Florida in the winter months, and he just wasn't able to make it back and forth. We did have a highly recommended and wonderfully qualified speaker to present for us. Today we have Andy Cusack, who is the owner-operator of Beach Ridge Motor Speedway, and he will be addressing automobile racing history in the state of Maine. I'd like to have a round of applause for Andy Cusack. I hope you enjoy the program.
Thank you. Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming out today to spend some time with us. So just so I can kind of get a feel for what the interest in auto racing in Maine is from our audience today, tell me a little bit, show of hands, how many of you have been to a Maine short track racetrack? Wow, that's outstanding, a lot of it. In this area, Unity Raceway, Speedway 95, Cusack, any to Beach Ridge? Been to Beach Ridge, wow, great turnout, thank you very much. Oxford, Spud Speedway, way up north. Spud Speedway, that's wonderful. Great little track. Excellent. How many of you attended the Thurlow Hill Climb? Nobody attended the Thurlow Hill Climb. Probably a good thing, because that was 104 years ago. Nobody in here is more than 104 years old? Anybody feel like you're 104 years old some days? Some days, I know. That was June 17th, 1911, and the significance of the Thurlow Hill Climb, which took place, what is today Route 26, in front of the Poland Spring Hotel. The significance is that it was the first documented auto race of sorts in the state of Maine. It ran a story in the Lewiston Sun-Journal. They recapped the event. It takes place about 2 weeks after the Indianapolis 500, and there's a gentleman that comes over with his car from the Indy 500. He had raced in the 500. The last name is Belcher, so he's kind of the big shot for this event. And the Maine Automobile Association is the organization that puts the event on, the Thurlow Hill Climb. And of course, in those days, 104 years ago, we think of hills today as a straight drive up the hill. On those days, the vehicles really couldn't make a straight drive up much of a grade, so they had to zigzag the road to get up any type of incline. So they closed the road down. It's today Route 26. They close it down. A number of people come in, a dozen or so cars come in to compete in this event. Lewiston Sun-Journal covers it. Belcher's there, and he walks the course, checks it all out, he walks all up and down. It's a 2/3 of a mile course, just 2/3 of a mile. And they're going to run one car at a time, and they'll do kind of a speed race to see who can make it the fastest up there. And Belcher is the favorite. So he walks the course, checks it all out, makes several passes on foot before he's going to go, so he can figure out which way he's going to make this zigzag. Finally, there's a little bit of ceremony. There's a big crowd. They're lined up both sides of what is Route 26. They're lined up both sides of the hill to watch, attracting great crowds. Belcher gets in his car, and there's a little bit of ceremony, and the starters are pointing at everybody, making sure everybody's set on the course, so off Belcher goes. Heads up the hill, he zigs, he zags, he gets a tire over a berm, he gets bounced out of his car, flies right out of the car, and whacks himself into a maple sapling on the side of the road. Flat out. There's a Portland police officer there. He runs up to the scene, looks at Belcher, checks him all over, stands up, says, "He's dead." The word goes up and down the hill. Everybody's, "He's dead, he's dead, he's dead, dead." A minute or two later, Belcher kind of gets up on his knees, dusts himself off. He's just a little stunned, not quite dead yet. And he gets back in his automobile, he backs it down the hill, he makes another run, he does pretty good with it. He makes a couple more runs during the course of the day. He does win the event. He's the fastest run, 48 seconds to go 2/3 of a mile up the hill. But that was the start of documented racing in Maine. It was a big event, it was over well. They anticipated that they would do it a second year, and it did not come back, or there was no documentation of it. Nobody can find that the event comes back for a second season. But it's interesting, that's June of 2011. What does happen later in 1911, got ahead of myself. What does happen in 1911 is that flat track oval racing is catching on in the United States. There aren't many purpose-built speedways to race on for a flat track. There aren't a lot of them. Indianapolis is one of them. But there aren't many out there, so a person can't just go race at a track like they can today. So what wannabe race drivers found out is they could race on beaches, because at low tide, the sand's very hard packed, and there was plenty of room and many beaches to race. And Ormond Beach in Florida, just below Daytona Beach, was one of the real popular places for this. It was kind of a renowned speedway at the time on the beach at low tide. But the number 2 place in the country for notoriety for racing was Old Orchard Beach. Who's been to Old Orchard? Oh, Old Orchard, that's great. So the Thurlow Hill Climb is June 1911. Labor Day weekend, September 1911, they run a race on Old Orchard Beach. And the race is put on, this is interesting, by the American Automobile Association, AAA. They actually sanctioned races, and a lot of races back in those days. They partnered up with the Old Orchard Beach Motor Club. They had their own motor club. And they put on this race. It was a big event, really big. Reports at the time and newspapers claim about 50,000 people come to the event. They run special trains out of Boston to bring everybody up that wants to be here and check it out. And it was really primarily put on as an effort for profit for the Old Orchard Beach Motor Club and to attract tourism to Old Orchard Beach and some notoriety. So they put on the event. They start, if you're familiar with Old Orchard Beach, the pier. The pier has been rebuilt several times in its lifetime, but the pier is always where the pier is, even today. They make a starting line just a little south of the pier, and if you're familiar with Old Orchard Beach, you head south and down past the Brunswick Hotel, a little further down, way past the amusements. There's a road called Atlantic Avenue. And right about parallel with that, they just put a marker in the beach sand, a big pole. The drivers have to race down, go around the pole, head back, and get this, they race under the pier. Okay? They're going to navigate the pylons, race under the pier, and they go about 1.5 miles north towards Scarborough, where there's another marker, and turn, of course, and come back and race under the pier again, and continue doing oval laps there. It's a 5-mile course that they set up. And they have some support races, some qualifying races over that Labor Day weekend. And it all culminates in a 100-mile race contest at the end. And about a dozen competitors in that as well. Again, this racing thing is kind of a new thing. The automobile's fairly new, so it attracts good crowds. It does so well that the motor club is concerned people are going to see it for free. They're charging 50 cents. They're afraid people are going to see it for free. So they put up some canvas all along the road route so that people can't see through the screen, although a lot of people stood on the backs of porches and roofs and the backs of automobiles if they had them. It's a huge event. It does really well as far as crowd goes. The gentleman that wins the race does it in about 98 minutes, or an average speed of about 60 miles per hour. Of course, they have higher top speeds, and this is pretty good for 1911. And in the end, when the event's all over after a couple of days of racing, the club loses money. That many people, but they lose money. So they think, well, what if we move it to the 4th of July? So the next year, they come back with the races at Old Orchard Beach, and they do it on the 4th of July, 1912. Again, huge crowds, extra trains, 50,000 plus people there. And that's substantial when you think of 50,000 people at a sporting event in Maine in 1911. It would be a big deal today, let alone 1911. Everything goes great. They have to, the 100-mile race, by the time they get to it, it takes a while to do all the qualifying. There were some delays and things aren't really up to speed at that time. So the 100-mile race, they have one problem with it, and that is the tide comes in. So they shorten the race to 75 miles. Today, where the Beach Ridge is, our facility, we're in Scarborough, and we're only by air, less than 2 miles from the ocean. To this day, we fight fog many times during the course of the race. Even the tide will change, there'll be fog. We can see the fog out over the ocean. And we can see the big fog bank there. We're trying to move the program along so that we can get it in. And if that tide changes, it'll push the fog right in. And there's been many times at Beach Ridge, it's had to cancel part of the event, shorten the event because of fog. In this case, the water came in. It was high tide. Still, the motor club loses money. So they think, well, let's do it again next year. They're going to come back on the 4th of July, 1913. They come back with it again the third year. This time they give tickets away. They make it free just to attract all the tourism there. And they figure if they fill up the hotels and all the restaurants and all that thing, it'll be good for business. Now, believe it or not, giving all the tickets away for free, I'm no economist, but they lost money again. So that plan didn't work very well in 1913. But that was the end of the races on Old Orchard Beach. They did it 3 years. They claimed they've lost money every year, and they did not continue it on. This AAA club continues to, thank you. The AAA club continues to present races at different fairground tracks in the state of Maine and the Northeast. And they do some at the fairground tracks like Skowhegan and Bangor and Skowhegan, Bangor. There was a third one that did Lewiston. Was a big one. Before we go with that, let's take a little look. And thank you, Ethan, for reminding me. We have pictures at Old Orchard Beach. So here they are, taking a look at that. There's the pier. Those are the types of vehicles they're racing. So you can imagine what it's like trying to navigate under the pylons twice every lap, over 100 miles. And you can see the crowd. Some of the pier in the background, those big kind of crowns were part of the pier back in those days. All the cars are lined up, and again, substantial audience there for that event. I'll let you take a look at those for a moment. Some did have, there were questions, are there 2 people per car? Yeah, and a lot of those races back in those days, I don't know exactly what the passenger was doing. Some would say navigating, trying to figure out how much fuel they need and whatnot.
Some of them had boilers on there that they
Boilers, probably.
squeeze them out with.
Sure, so a riding mechanic essentially. Yeah. I don't know, I wasn't there.
No, I won't.
You were there? You were there. So when the AAA club continues to race during the 1920s and 30s, they go to these fairground tracks in the state of Maine. And that goes all right for a while. They're not attracting a whole lot of vehicles. They're getting a dozen, so it's essentially a traveling circus. They're touring around, it's the same drivers going from horse track to horse track. The fairgrounds tended not to like that a whole lot because it tore up their horse tracks, and the horsemen didn't really like it, but again, there were no purpose-built speedways at the time to be able to go race on. So meanwhile, in Scarborough, Maine, there's a kid that moved from New Brunswick with his family when he was just a child. And he's grown up by this point. He's about in his late 20s, and he's an airplane mechanic. There's a little airport in Scarborough, which was the predecessor to the Portland International Jetport we have today. First, there was an airstrip in Scarborough. And he learns to work on airplanes there. His name is Jim McConnell. And he works on airplanes in Scarborough. He gets an opportunity to go to Boston to work on airplanes down there. So he moves to Boston, works on airplanes, doing his thing, but he finds out there's a little Boston Motor Club down there, and they hold races in the area every now and then. So he goes to some of the races, and he just finds it fascinating. He's a mechanic by trade, he sees these cars racing, he thinks it's really wonderful. So he does this for a few years going there, and he starts to get to know the organizers from the Boston Motor Club, and he tells them, he says, you know, he said, I'm from Maine. And he said, I think this stuff would really work in Maine. And he said, you got to bring these guys up, you got to bring the Boston Motor Club up, and let's go race someplace in Maine. And they kind of give him a nod and say, okay, well, you know, we'll think about it. Well, he pushes and pushes, and finally he gets it set up that they can run a race at the Thompson Fairgrounds near Brunswick. So he rents the facility, gets it set up for the motor club, they bring their drivers up, and Jim McConnell, who I had the pleasure of knowing and dealing with, he only passed away a few years ago in his 90s. Brilliant man, he did everything by hand, just a skilled tradesman, no real formal education other than working with his hands and being good at it. And I asked him, I said, so the Thompson Fairground race, tell me about that. So you bring the motor club up. I said, how did it go? And he said, well, he said, we had only a few cars and we had even fewer people. He said it was just a complete disaster. It didn't go well at all. So that was the one and only trip to the Thompson Fairgrounds for the Boston Motor Club, but Jim still felt like this could work in the state of Maine. He moves back from Boston to Maine, back to his roots in Scarborough, a few years later, and he's an entrepreneur. He opens up a sawmill and a lumbering business. He's out cutting people's land for them if they want to build them a house. He cuts it, and sometimes in pavement, he takes other land that they held in trade. And that's how he gets paid for some of his work. And gets the logs off their property, he takes them back to his lumber mill, and he saws them out and sells the lumber and all that. Well, after a few years of doing this, he ends up with a nice little contiguous piece of property in Scarborough, 100 acres or so, on Holmes Road. And he realizes, you know what, I think I could put a racetrack here. So this is 1948 that he finally commits to doing it. He organizes some people, tries to get some help, he tries to get financing. He can't find any financing at all. Nobody will give him a nickel to do it. But he puts together a little band of helpers, and they start bulldozing out a third of a mile oval. This is no blueprint. Everything is done line of sight, just by Jim's gut, how they're going to do it. And they work on it. Now, mind you, in 1948, I'll show you a little newspaper article that comes out. So in 1948, first thing he does, he carves out the oval itself, and you can see in the bottom photo, that's him on a bulldozer running around there. He mills out, he's got a sawmill, he mills out his own lumber. That's his lumber, it's the grandstand, the first Beach Ridge grandstand. You see the little building up on the top, he's got to have a place for scorers to work. So he builds everything himself, all the crib work that's supporting the grandstand. He cuts the trees, cuts the lumber, and then nails it together to make his own grandstand. He has to hold meetings to get drivers interested to compete at the racetrack because we're starting at ground zero here. It's the first purpose-built speedway in the state of Maine. There's nothing else to go off of. So he has to convince people that this is going to be a fun thing to do and start getting drivers interested to do it. He sets up a governing board. He gets people that are interested. He sets up a board of directors, vice presidents, presidents, that will administer the auto races at Beech Ridge. He's going to own the track. He's going to have them administer their own race competition. But he has to have meetings for that. He has to make up a rule book. There's nothing out there. He's going to make up a rule book from scratch. He has to build the outbuildings. He has to build storage buildings to keep everything there. He has to build things like outhouses, snack shacks, all by hand, all of his own lumber. He runs the wiring and the plumbing, digs wells, all on his own. He has to run newspaper ads trying to attract drivers. He fields all the phone calls at his own house, takes care of all that. In addition to that, the number little 24 car here you see at the bottom is one of Jim's cars. There's a shop not far away. He has 4 or 5 race cars built that winter as well, because he knows when I open up, I gotta have some kind of cars on the track, but if nobody shows up. So he has 4 or 5 cars built for himself, kind of house cars. And he goes out in Scarborough and finds people that he knows they're brave enough to do this, and he lines up 4 or 5 of his own drivers. So now he's guaranteed at opening day to have at least 4 or 5 cars. These are all the things that he has to do. In the meanwhile, he's still running this sawmill business. He's still cutting trees for other people. He's still selling the lumber that he cuts. And of course, he's got downtime in the winter where he can't be working at the speedway. He can't be doing anything outside. So this is all in 1948 that it all gets started, but it takes about 18 months, and yet he manages to pull it off. On the end of May, Memorial Day weekend, 1949, he opens Beech Ridge Speedway. This is actually a 1950 advertisement here, a year later. And again, Jim has to put these ads together as well. He has to deal with the newspapers, put all these things together. That's Jim, a story that ran. Actually, I don't think that's at Beech Ridge itself. I think they might have been at a fairground track. Jim would take his band of drivers, once Beech Ridge got going, he'd take those drivers to other tracks, fairground tracks, mostly around the state of Maine. He helped develop Oxford Plains Speedway, helped with Unity Speedway as well. I asked Jim, I said, so you open in 1949, May of 1949. I said, how did that race go? Having heard about the whole Thompson debacle, I said, well, I was opening day at Beech Ridge. And he said, that was a public relations disaster. It's a pure dirt track, as you can see in the previous photo we had. It's a pure dirt track. And he said, nobody knows about auto racing yet. Nobody knows what you're supposed to do when you go to a race. So it's a Sunday that he opens. Everybody heads to church in the morning. They're all dressed in their Sunday best, nice white shirts. It was great. They heard about this place opening, so they all fled to the racetrack. So they had a great crowd. But he said it was a nightmare, because everybody went away from there filthy. Women in their nice white dresses, men with their nice white shirts. So he had to do a little bit of work to try to convince people that he was going to get some water down on the dirt and things were going to get better. And as it turns out, everything did get better. But it was not a very good start for him, and he had to learn trial by fire. This is Jim, by the way. That's him, obviously, in the very first few years of promoting. This is Jim at the Speedway just a couple of years before he passed away. He was still very sharp. I would enjoy, he'd be at the racetrack, we'd talk, and he could tell me within about 16 people how many people were in the grandstand. I'd go back and get the notes a week later when I got to my desk, and I'm like, son of a gun, he was so close. I didn't even know how many people were there. He runs Beech Ridge at a loss for several years. It takes about 7 or 8 years before he can actually turn a profit. But he hangs in there, and the track survives. He runs it for about 20 years himself. Then he sells it to a former race driver and former flagman of his, Calvin Reynolds, who owns Reynolds Motorsports, a motorcycle shop. Kelvin ran it for about a decade. Kelvin sold it to my parents. Our family started running it. That was 1981, and we've run it for the past few decades now. So the Speedway has only had three generations or three sets of family owners. The McConnells, the Reynolds, and now the Cusacks. And it's entering its 65th year coming up this year. Continuous operation, it's never closed, it's raced every season. There are a few businesses in the state of Maine that can claim that, let alone something that's a seasonal business and quite a novelty business, and something that was completely unknown at the time when it was developed. So obviously we're very proud of what it continues to achieve. This was one of the early photos at Beech Ridge. That's the original grandstand. You can see in that newspaper article we saw, you can see how he was not nearly yet done building the grandstand, but that's how big he actually builds the grandstand all out of his own lumber. And again, accomplishing this in about 18 months. That was one of the early race crowds at the Speedway. It's a little then and now, same vantage point. Some of you who've been to the Speedway know what it's like now. The grandstand is different. The original grandstand was all wooden. This is now a galvanized steel framework. And it actually, the framework, Jim was a pretty crafty guy, very resourceful. The framework for the grandstand that's still there today came from one of Dwight Eisenhower's inaugurations. It was made by Hussey Manufacturing, which is a big grandstand manufacturer out of Berwick, Maine. And they were contracted with the government to set up for one of Eisenhower's, I don't know, it was 53 or 57 when his inauguration ran. And once they were done with it, it was a one-day deal, they take the grandstand down and apparently brought it back to Berwick with them. Had not much to do with it, and Jim struck up a deal, got the framework and got it up to Scarborough and made what is the grandstand today. So he went through 2 grandstands while he was there, all in under 20 years. The track started as a pure dirt track. Later, Jim, when there were dust issues, later Jim coated the dirt track with clay, which is kind of the norm for dirt tracks today. When we say it's a dirt track, it's really a clay track. And it's acted a lot like asphalt, although it would develop holes, potholes, night to night. But by putting the clay down, then they would oil the clay, they could treat it, roll it in, and that really helped keep the dust. And it was still dirty. If some of you were at Beech Ridge when it was a dirt track, yes? I'm guessing, yeah. So you know. I still have some of the dirt in my hair. It's never really come out of my scalp after all these years. We finally paved the racetrack in 1986. So it ran a lot of years as dirt or clay. Now it's run about 30 years as an asphalt track. We signed on with NASCAR. They came to us and wanted us to be part of their short track weekly series in 1995. NASCAR only sanctions about 60 tracks like Beech Ridge in the country. They're pretty particular about who they sign on. Of course, we all know about NASCAR's bigger tracks from Daytona to Charlotte and Texas and every place else. But NASCAR needs a feeder system just like the NFL or the Major League Baseball, any of those organizations. They need to cultivate young talent, bring them up through. And this is NASCAR's way of doing that too, starting at a short track like Beech Ridge, sanctioning races there, working with the facility, working with the drivers, and hopefully getting them to progress up into maybe a regional touring series and eventually get up into their big touring series. A little bit of then and now. That was then with the original grandstand, starting lineup. More now. Same thing, different cars, right? The car on the right, the number 22, is my dad. Here he's about 17 years old, his first race car. The car on the outside, the 119, is Dick Garrett. Dick Garrett won the first 3 championships at Beech Ridge, and Garrett was, the 119 car, was one of Jim McConnell's house cars that Jim had built in his garage. You can see the dust, so you can imagine. This is one of the early years. You can see how much dust is created on the pure dirt track. This is before it was clay. Anybody recognize the cars?
glass windshield?
glass. Yep. A little bit of now. Kind of get the comparison. Now the windshields are all, these are all Lexan plastic windshields now. Again, back then, the flagman's down on the inside of the track. You can see his flag's over to the right. It's kind of a precarious spot to be in as a flagman, but that's what everybody did back in those days. So there's another starting lineup at early Beach Ridge. Another starting lineup more closer to today.
Did it become a 3/8 or half mile?
It's a 1/3 of a mile.
It's still one.
It's always been 1/3 of a mile, yeah. All the tracks in Maine are pretty much 1/3 of a mile. Give it, some are measured on the inside of the track, some on the outside of the track. Jim McConnell, because built Beach Ridge, that was the first track. Anybody remember the Knolls from Unity Speedway? Those of you who've been to Unity, you know the Knolls, know of them. Ed Knowles came to see Jim in the fall of the first year of Beach Ridge, so the fall of 1949. Ed stops in and sees Jim McConnell. He's like, listen, you got to get with me on this project up at the Unity horse track. He said, there's tons of people up there. They'll love this thing. They've got nothing else to do. They're going to love racing. You got to help me put this together. So Jim did go up. He helped him form the track a little bit. It was pretty well in place because it was an operating horse track. Jim told me Ed was quite almost a carnival operator. In fact, he had some carnival rides. And he was just so enthusiastic about this. He said, you know, people up there, they got nothing else to do. We're going to pack the place. They're going to be hanging out of the trees to watch this stuff up there. Jim says, I get there, and he said, literally, they're hanging out of the trees. He said, they're sitting in the trees. The place is sold out, and they're sitting up in the trees around the racetrack. That was fall 1949. The event got rained out. They had to go back in the spring of 1950 and have Unity's first race. Will Beach Ridge early operations. We tried to organize these so you kind of, this is headed into turn one. Sending into turn one. And today headed into turn one. I think that's turn two, coming out of turn two. Yeah, the guy in the 34 is not having a good time right now. There's a caution, guy getting yanked away on the wrecker. There's a little view from the grandstand, you know, sitting in the grandstand, obviously looking across some of the other fans. And today looking into the grandstand, obviously the different grandstand, different tower. Unfortunately, we don't have any really good aerial pictures of the speedway back in those days. But that's closer to today. Gives you an idea how it's morphed over the years. Pit area, in this case, Ethan showed me how to run the laser. I don't dare touch it, but it's back here. I'm sure I'll mess up the whole slide presentation. This is our pit area back here. The cars enter the racetrack here, and they exit over on the far side to come back into the pit area. We can use the infield pit road as well on special events. And most of the time we're in the back pit. We couldn't fit everybody into the infield pit. Occasionally cars crash. It's interesting that even here in the early, obviously the original grandstand that Jim built, He's got the infield poles as well. He's got speakers up on the front poles. I mean, the amount that had to go into 18 months of work amazes me to this day. This guy just wants out. This next one is the front page of it's called Illustrated Speedway, and this is at Beech Ridge. Bertrand Lord, I think, was the driver's name. Flipped it, ended up on his nose, and there it stood, enough that he could climb out. That got a lot of national coverage. Can't read the date. Is it 1959? 1959? So this is 10 years into it. We still crash stuff occasionally today. This is one of our novelty events. It's either a day of destruction or car wars. I don't remember which, but more just stock vehicles. In 64 years now complete, everyone always wants to know, people died doing this. 2 people have died in race-related accidents at Beech Ridge. It's not bad considering, it's never a good period, but considering 65 years, the amount of cars and drivers that have come through this place, the amount of laps that have been turned around this, the amount of miles that have been put on here. That is that. This is Dick Bergman's car. I want to talk a little bit about Dr. Bergman. This was opening day at Beech Ridge, and Bergman had come up with this new sprint car he had, and didn't fare particularly well this day. He said it all but destroyed it. But he took it back, and he and his crew rebuilt, and they brought it back and continued to race. But it really looked like it was done for. But just for comparison's sake, so that you know, that's that, right off to the left. Yep. Dr. Berggren is a doctor of psychology. He was a professor as well, taught psychology later on. He has a bigger career in racing than he ever did in psychology. By his choice, because he's just a race nut. He loves it. He raced for about 20 years through southern New England and into Beech Ridge. He arrived at Beech Ridge in the early mid-1970s. He was probably there a couple times, 72, 73, just a couple of times. But 74, he decides to really make a full-scale attempt with this car. So he shows up, and he's fast. I was there. I got to watch him. He was a very fast driver. Did a great job. He ended up winning twice in his first year, 1974. The place is still a clay track at the time. The existing track speed record in 1974 was held by Dick Wolstenholme. It was 16.4 something seconds. Dick Bergman beats that record in 1975. He knocks it down to 16.3. So Bergman takes the new speed record, 16.3 on the Beech Ridge clay. A few weeks later, he breaks his own record from 16.3 down to 16.2 in the same year, 1975. Excuse me, 1970, yes it was 74. Then he comes back again the next season and breaks his previous 2 records, breaks it again. He sets the track record at 16.0 seconds flat. And that remained the dirt track speed record for history. Obviously it's paved now. So this is the car that went 16 seconds flat at Beech Ridge. And Bergman will forever be recorded as the fastest man on dirt at Beech Ridge. He won, sorry? Yeah, those are 454 big blocks they ran in those. Yeah.
Have the sprint cars ever run on the asphalt?
No, the sprint cars never ran on the asphalt. Modifieds ran on the asphalt eventually. Bergman won about 20 races in just a few years of competition at Beech Ridge. He was that good. He was super fast, and he was always innovating, always trying to come up with something new. He and Doug Gore, who was his chief mechanic on that, were just really brilliant with things they tried. They're also very safety conscious and innovated a lot of safety things, not only at Beech Ridge, but beyond, because in the 1970s, Bergman becomes the executive editor of Stock Car Racing magazine. It's a national magazine, and Bergman is a great writer, so he becomes the executive editor for that magazine for Lopez Publications. And he pioneers a second magazine while he's with Lopez. He pioneers a second magazine called Open Wheel Magazine. So now he's writing and editing two magazines at the same time. He's flying back and forth to race at Beech Ridge a little bit, but he's getting busier. He also becomes a national broadcaster. This is Bergman when he was racing with us. You can see the left front up in the air. A lot of the cars got their left fronts, so the P38 behind is Homer Drew, his left front's in the air too. It was all about transferring the weight to the right rear to get grip. So Bergman's time becomes less and less available as he's becoming editors of magazines. And he's starting to do some work for ESPN on TV, doing some pit road reporting. He's running radio shows as well. You notice in some of these pictures it has this wind foil on the top. The reason it doesn't have that is at the end of the sprint cars at Beech Ridge, the last year they ran in 1978, they didn't allow them to run wings. They took the wings off them. And that was the last time that Bergman ran his. Yeah, kind of helping to keep the speeds down. Plus they were trying to phase in these modifieds, which were not as powerful as these. They're a small block modified, 350 Chevys instead of the 455s. So in order to give the modifieds a fighting chance, they ran the modifieds and the sprint cars together to give them a little fighting chance. They made the sprint cars take the wings off so they couldn't maintain all that down pressure that was the advantage of having the wing. Ms. Bergman interviewing Tony Stewart. He's working for the Speed Channel, I think, on that one. He's a broadcaster for Fox Sports Network, too. He just got done with Fox in the past year. Had a nice 20-year career broadcasting on national TV. This is the same one, yeah. Dr. Bergman. It's just coming together, right? Oh, you've been watching him all this time, right? Oh, it was him. He knew it. He knew it from the ground up because he'd been there in race cars. He's also, Dr. Bergman has also founded a New England History Racing Preservation Group. His ultimate goal is to put a museum, a Northeast Motorsports Museum in New England. I serve on the board of directors with this organization, and recently in November, they voted to put the museum on the Speedway, New Hampshire Motor Speedway's property. They donated a piece of land to us, so sometime in the next couple of years anyway, we hope to start construction on that, maybe even this year. Yes?
Do you ever have any offie cars?
We did not at Beech Ridge. Not that I ever saw. The question was if we have any offie cars to start a type of sprint car, and we did not have those. A little later, when you're leaving, on the back table, there are some forms. Excuse me. It's got a mailing address if you want to purchase this book. This is also a book that Dick Bergman has edited. He put a panel of writers together, the history of auto racing in New England. Some of the images that are up here today are in this book. This is 300 pages, over 400 photos, and really goes in depth about racing all across New England. Maine alone has 30 pages in this book. So a lot of good information about all these speedways we talked about at the opening today. Every track gets some coverage in here. So as you exit today on the back table, we've got more up here if you need them. Dick always went the extra mile. He was very safety conscious, always trying to push safety through his magazine. He was always willing to do anything he'd ask of anybody else. So for one of the cover shots of the magazine, they wanted to do a story about fire suit safety, being safe in fires inside of a race car. So This was a cover shot. So Bergman said, you know, okay, we want to dress somebody up in a fire suit, safety helmet and all that, fireproof gloves, and set them on fire for this. And they said, that's a great idea. You do it. So Dick said, okay, so that's Bergman inside the fire suit. Willing to do whatever he asked somebody else to do. The yellow car on the other side of the room belonged to Dick McCabe. Dick started racing at Beech Ridge in the late 60s and early 1970s with that car. He was very successful. Won a lot of races at Beech Ridge. He never won a championship at Beech Ridge. Maybe because he didn't stay long enough to accomplish that. He was with us for probably 4 or 5 years, but he was good enough, quick enough, and he attracted enough attention from some other people that he was able to go off tour racing around New England. First with the American Canadian Tour, later with NASCAR North. He won 2 championships, each with the American Canadian Tour and with NASCAR North. So he won 4 total regional touring championships in New England. In the Oxford 250, he finished in the top 3 5 times, which is quite an accomplishment to be able to do. That's a huge race. He won it once in 1988. He also eventually went to Daytona to race on the big track there in what were called the Sportsman 300 races, if some of you remember that. They were, back at the time, the Sportsman Series eventually became the Busch Series, eventually became the Nationwide Series, and today is the Xfinity Series for NASCAR. So the second tier below the Cup level. And on Saturdays in Daytona Beach on the big track in Daytona, they would have the Sportsman race, a 300-mile race instead of 500 miles. McCabe ran that 3 different times, 84, 85, 88, averaged about a 15th place finish, which is still a huge accomplishment. He didn't win, but it's still a huge accomplishment for a guy from Maine to get into Daytona and race against all those guys and everything that they have for equipment and technology and experience, and had done it time and time. He only did it 3 times and still makes the top 15. There are only 3 race drivers in the Maine Sports Hall of Fame. The Maine Sports Hall of Fame is primarily kind of a stick and ball organization recognizing accomplishments of basketball and baseball players. A lot of them are high school, college athletes that they recognize who've had big careers, maybe went on to become coaches and such. But they have put in just 3 race drivers into the Maine Sports Hall of Fame, and Dick McCabe was the first one. So McCabe was first. My dad, Ralph Cusack, was the second person to go into the Maine Sports Hall of Fame. And recently, a couple of years ago, Ricky Craven. Okay. So, kind of gives you an idea of McCabe's accomplishments. The question is, what is Craven doing now? He's primarily doing some broadcasting now. He still lives down south. He's been contracted. I think he's starting to air more coming in the middle of the summer. He's starting to develop quite a nice broadcasting career. He still keeps a place in Greenville on Moosehead Lake, camp up there. It's up here quite a bit. Ricky's very bright, articulate, intelligent, does a great job, and is really good for the sport to be on air. Represents it very well. So who's been to New Hampshire Motor Speedway? Okay, is this you here? Is that where you sat? It looks a little familiar. Maybe this is the one. Is this the one? That's what you were thinking. Well, before there was Bob Bears from Maine, most of you know. Before Bob Bear built this speedway in Loudon, New Hampshire, which opened up in 1990, as I recall, first Cup race in 1993. Before there was a New Hampshire Motor Speedway, there was a Rockingham track in Salem, New Hampshire. So same state, similar crowds. This is a dirt track, and there was a gentleman who promoted some races in the Boston area. The Rockingham facility, he manages to come upon and wants to put a dirt track there. He wants to make it into a board track. And the reason that he'd like to make a board track, and to wonder what a board track is, it's just a racetrack made out of lumber. They call them board tracks. He thinks this will work. His name's Jack LeCain. He's from the Boston area. He's promoted a little bit of racing down there. As you know, Jim McConnell was down in the Boston area with his Boston Motor Club. This is 1925. But before he builds the board track, he wants to decide, wants to see if this will really work. So he carves out 1.25 miles dirt track. So this is just pure dirt. No clay, none of that. Again, this is real early days, 1925. Opens it up for an event, and as you can see by the crowd, it does pretty well. They claim, again, that the reports are all over the place, no good way to measure attendance back in those days. I would pick 50,000 people. Reports vary in different articles from 38,000 to 100,000, but I think we can say 50,000. I think it's a berm. I think that's a good point because, again, he's trying to find out if this will really work. So this is a test. This is a test race. He built the place in 35 days. I don't think there's a real grandstand there. It couldn't be, you know. He does this quick. He puts it together in 35 days. This race is the 4th of July, 1925. He wants to see if it will do well. He wants to see if it will attract some financiers to get involved so he can build his board track. Well, it works. It was poor weather on the 4th of July, but it still draws this kind of crowd. It's reported to be the largest crowd ever to attend a New England sporting event as of that time, and you would have to think that's true. 50,000 people. I don't know at that time if there was anything else. The ballparks couldn't hold, Fenway could not hold that many people at the time. So it does that well. It's dusty, just like the Beech Ridge dirt and the public relations disaster that McConnell had on his hands. These people did too, but that's why he wants to do a board track, because in those days, pavement was not yet sufficiently developed to handle the stress that fast race cars would put on it, especially going into the turns. Pavement wasn't that strong yet that they could do that. So what happened is people would build these board tracks, and there were only about 5 or 6 of them, big tracks, big board tracks, ever built in the country. LeCain runs this, it goes well. He gets financing, and he goes to work building a board track. And this is amazing because this is 4th of July, 1925. He puts together this board track. Jim McConnell had it beat. This goes together for for October of 1925. He's got a board track ready. And you can see, if you look underneath the cars, it's kind of shiny and everything. Look at the retaining walls they've built. It takes 3 million board feet of lumber. 3 million board feet of lumber. The largest purchase of lumber at the time in the Northeast. It takes more than 53 tons of nails. The turns are 4 stories tall. Look at the crib work to support the turns. 4 stories tall. The degree of banking is almost 50 degrees. That's about 17 degrees more than Talladega and Daytona today. With some effort, you can get up Daytona and Talladega's banks. With some effort, you can climb up there and get to the top. This one you couldn't. Almost 50 degrees of banking. I don't know what kind of wood it was. I don't know what would be the best wood. I wasn't there, by the way. Again, I wasn't there.
Could the cars achieve the speed to get up there?
The cars achieved speeds at this track of between 125 and 140 miles an hour in 1925. Can you believe it? It was substantially perilous to race on these tracks, dangerous and sometimes deadly.
Out of curiosity about the track surfaces, nobody ever attempted concrete?
There are some concrete tracks today.
Okay.
At the time, that wasn't an option for building a track there.
Probably spruce.
I would think spruce would be
Spruce
a
was
lot
being
better.
harvested at that time in Maine.
Was it? Okay. It was reported the cost was about $750,000 to build this place. Again, I'm not an economist. If somebody could figure that out, if somebody could run those numbers through, there's probably an app for that, but I don't know what that would be in today's numbers, but obviously in the many millions today. So the first board track race got rained out a couple of times in October. It finally ran on Halloween Day of 1925, and it does great. Big crowds again, another 50,000 people. They run 2 races in 1926 on this track. The crowd started to shrink a little bit in 1926. The car counts began to dwindle a little bit. They usually only had a dozen, 15 cars anyway. And they're typically national cars, national drivers that are coming here to do this. But after a few times of doing it, the cars dwindle a little bit. Crowds go down a little bit. In 1927, they scheduled 2 more races. Things aren't getting a lot better. In spite of having great crowds, it's not turning a profit, it's not doing well. By October of 1927, only 2 years into it, they're facing foreclosure on the facility.
Why?
50,000 people, I don't know. Maybe they gave their tickets away too, like Old Orchard Beach did. But I don't know. I don't understand why either, but I mean, you can appreciate it's a $750,000 build at the time. They're only running a couple of races a year. They've got big crowds, but being in the racing business myself, I can tell you it's difficult to operate a place just a few times a year.
You think that 50,000 number has anything to do with it? They did well back in 1911, 50,000.
I know. You're right. Hey, I'll take 50,000 people. If I get 50,000 people, I'll do it just once and go home. See you next year. So by October 1927, they're facing foreclosure. They come back in 1928. They're going to run a race in October. Now they're 3 years into it. And now worse, the board track is coming undone. So during the race, the boards are heaving. They're warping, they're heaving, they're sighing. That's making the track more dangerous. They built the whole crib work. Go back to that picture. The whole place is built right on the ground. There's no footings. Okay. So obviously after a few New Hampshire winters and rain during the summer and springs and all that, the wood begins to rot, including the board track itself. And that became part of the problem. They were facing having to rebuild it, and there was just really no good hope for it at that point. It didn't help matters that this is 1928, and we've got the Great Depression on its way. So October 1928 was the last race on the board track, and then it was torn down in 1929. But it's interesting today, of course, we all think of the Speedway in New Hampshire as being New Hampshire Motor Speedway, but first it was this in 1925 through 28, and it still drew huge crowds and did very well for the time, in spite of not being profitable enough to continue on. Coming back around to today's climate of racing, Beach Ridge and really any sporting event has had to become kind of much more metropolitan today than we used to. We used to be able just to put on a race. People would come out to see cool cars go around fast. Today, things are more about making it family friendly. The kids, it's our mascot, Speedy, one of our 2 mascots. We have to present our shows in a much more timely way than we used to years ago, than we used to be able to. We have a bus. We take kids around the track on Speedy's bunny bus. This is one of our other mascots at our Friday night series called Car Wars. This is our mascot, Firefly. Rides a 4-wheeler, a dirt bike. I love, he's just a Don't tell anybody, there's just a guy wearing a suit, okay? Not a real superhero, but I love this. Look at the lady. This is a full-grown lady. She's going nuts over this guy. It's like, it's just Lycra.
Come on, is that you?
Spandex. I've done that, but not on purpose. There's a lot of competition today in the greater Portland market, and I think there is probably in most markets. Maine, of course, is a little smaller than a lot of other places around the country, but just in the greater Portland market, the things, people think, who do you compete against? Do you compete against Oxford? Well, we really don't. We don't compete against the other tracks. In fact, we work quite well with them. But the real competition for us today in the racing business at Beech Ridge is everything right around us. Tons of restaurants. So we're really competing for people's leisure time, let alone their leisure time dollars. People have to make decisions today on where they're going to put the investment of time. So everything from restaurants to the amusement parks around us, the beaches, even a Home Depot today. You folks have given part of your Saturday to be here today, but there are people who went to Home Depot yesterday and bought tile or linoleum, and they're redoing the bathroom today. And that becomes competition for their time for us. So we've had to become more than just cars going around in a circle. We have to be more widespread entertainment. Crowds are still responding pretty well. The place is still moving along pretty well after 65 years of doing this. We do a number of different events during the course of the season. They're not always straight up NASCAR races. We have a more amateur series on Thursday nights we call Thursday Thunder. The high-flying four-wheeler guy, that's our Friday night show called Car Wars. I think this was one of our Day of Destruction events. The crowds packed into. It's a full moon up there, that's why the photographer grabbed that. But it's still kind of a cool way to spend a summer night going to race. It's like you just can't find this kind of experience at other types of venues. We still like to light things up. We put on quite a big fireworks show. It's one of the biggest in the Portland area. We have the room to do it. Some of the ballparks and stuff do a nice fireworks show too, but they're confined. They've got a lot of buildings around. When you do fireworks, you have to have a lot of space. The more space you have, the bigger the shell you can put up in the air. And where we are, we've got enough space around us that we can put some big shells up in the air. So we get some really nice big balloons out of this. Every time I see those go off, I see 20s and 50s. Everybody else goes, ooh. I go, ah. We like to blow things up when we can. So we set a car out there, the red car, we threw a bunch of hay and kerosene in there and set it on fire. Found a guy that does some work with us. We said, what do you think about driving this other car we've got? What do you think about driving off a ramp and jam it right through the windshield of that car we're going to set on fire? He said, all right. We do a lot of things through the air and fire because, we've got the space to do it. We like it. My family, those that work with us, and we have a good time doing this because they were there all the time, so if we're going to be there, we want to have a good time doing it. This is part of our Friday night show. We've learned over the years, we have to get certain pyrotechnic licensing and all that, but we've learned over the years how to make bigger booms. So this was some of our early attempts at it, kind of a small flame. Then we figured out, wow, what did we do? Coming through the other way. And you can see the crowd in the background. One of the great things, again, we've got the room to do it, so we can kind of pull some things off that you can't get in the basketball court. We said, hey, what if we tow a camper? So what if we set up a ramp, hook a camper to your car, we put on that one, this was our fall event, fall finale event, so on the side of the camper, we wrote, in tribute to our tourist friends, we said, Massachusetts or bust. That on the side of the camper. Came flying out of the turns, drove it off, crashed into some other cars and set off some explosions when it went over. That's my brother in the brown shirt. He said, "What's up with the outhouse?" I said, "Well, we got an outhouse. I might as well blow it up." So you can't see much of it there, but you can kind of see the door flying off the front of it. And that's the next morning. That's all that's left of the outhouse. So sometimes we just blow up crap. You guys were great today. Thank you for your time. If I can answer any questions for you, please do.
Thank you very much, Andy. Those of you who do have questions, I would ask that you let me get over to you. I'd like to use the microphone so the rest of the audience can hear the question, so we understand what the answer relates to.
Yeah, I'm just wondering how you're doing financially. I mean, I know it's a tough business, but I'm just wondering how things are going.
Never good enough, but I'm looking for a sponsor. We're still doing okay. It is a struggle, and it's been harder in the recent economic climate of the past 8 or 9 years. One of the things we've not made, we're behind on our ticket pricing. We ought to be higher than we are, but I just haven't had the heart to do it. I didn't think that was right in the business climate today because people haven't had the money to spend. So we're still a pretty cheap ticket. I'm sure we'll probably have to increase next year or something, but overall it still does well. It pays the bills, and we can open up for the next season. So that's what we're happy about.
I noticed in one of the early photographs that you showed that the starting time was 8 o'clock at night.
Probably, was that the advertisement, probably?
I think so.
Yeah.
And I'm curious if you had lighting at that time, or if you would just run on into the dark and not worry about headlights, or?
Well, that was probably the 1950 advertisement, so it would have been the second year of Beach Ridge. And I don't know if Jim had lighting the first year or not, but I suspect he was running at 8 o'clock, then he had lighting by then in 1950, which again is another huge accomplishment. So that's a pretty big, every time I sit back in the grandstand at Beach Ridge and I look out there at the infield, I think, you could fit like 3 baseball fields just in that infield. And that's when you think about trying to run wiring all around that thing. Put up the poles, attach the lighting. It's an effort.
In those days, it took a lot of power.
Yes.
Rather than little lumens.
Yeah, according to CMP, it still does. Yes, question?
Hi, Andy, thanks a lot. Appreciate you coming out doing this. You can tell I'm down east, way down southeast. I have a question for you. Is there a concerted effort between yourself and Tommy Mayberry to move the Oxford 250 closer to the 400 in September?
The question, Oxford traditionally has done their 250 in July, and this year they've moved it to, gosh, it's the end of August? Yeah. Right, last week. Yeah. It came about more because of some scheduling at New Hampshire Speedway and coming down to the NASCAR Cup schedule is what it more came down to. The NASCAR Cup schedule changed something in July. The drivers used to have about a week off in July there, and they apparently changed that. And now that time off is going to be where the 250 is. And typically, Oxford has made the decision to run the 250 around that week off that the NASCAR drivers have, so that they might be able to pull a big name driver for the event. I don't know that that's Tom's focus to pull a big name driver, but I think that was his reasoning to move it into August so that, or late August, so that that week the fans have off too. They can come to the 250. So I think that was the strategy behind it. Tom and I work well together. We have a good friendship, and we. Thank you. So you've been to the 400 yet? Yeah. Tom Mayberry's Pro All-Star Series Tour comes to us in middle of September, and it's a big 300 lap main event, 100 lap main events, and it's a big few day event. It's a lot of fun. Thanks.
There is a New England Midget Racing Association. Do they ever come to your track?
Most recently, NEMA is what it's also called, New England Midget Association. It's been a while since I've been there, maybe 5 or 6 years.
It's a great show.
It is, and probably some of my favorite vehicles. I've always been a fan of these sprint cars, like Bergman's car. I kind of grew up on those things, and the little midget cars are just this thing smaller. I'll be around too. A couple more questions over here. I'll be around when this is over too, if anyone wants to come up and ask anything.
When you went from clay to asphalt, what kinds of cars could you run with just minor modifications, and what whole new classes show up?
Surprisingly, it was an easy transfer of the cars. We didn't have to change really any specifications for it. Most of the cars that ran with us were probably, they could have run on asphalt as it was. So really, it was just a matter of the drivers taking the same cars they had, tweaking a little bit of the setup of the car, tilting the wheels and everything. But that was about the major. But otherwise, everybody that raced with us on clay in 1985 came back and raced with us on asphalt in 1986. Pretty much the same automobile. So we didn't lose anything out of that.
I really appreciate you coming and giving the talk here. I'm Warren Kincaid, I'm the ground vehicle conservator here at the museum. But the interesting question early on about the who's the why a passenger in the early cars, and he was the mechanic, mechanician. You can say he's the curator, and his function, like the person that answered, was to pressurize the oil systems and the fuel systems, because they didn't have a fuel pump aside from that. But they also were definitely a mechanic. If you see the smaller poster over there in the corner, car skidding around the corner, and the mechanic is holding on to a spare tire, you would actually have to fix your car during a race because they broke down and had flat tires and all that. Then the question comes back, how in the world could you expect to win a race if you had to stop and fix your car? And the answer to that one is because everybody's stopping. But the other interesting thing was the photograph you had up in the beginning of Old Orchard Beach, this big wall mural here. I was looking at it, and all those cars in that picture showed up in the other picture, so they had to have been taken on the same day and pretty near the same location.
It might even, I don't know if it's the same photo, but it might well be, because there probably aren't a lot of those photos around.
Yeah. So the mechanic definitely had a real role in traveling along with the driver. They were both equally as busy.
You're knowledgeable. Now, were you there?
Pretty close. Yeah, pretty close. I feel like it in the morning.
One last question, and as Andy started to say, he'll be around. I'd like to point out in that small picture, take a close look at it. Not only is the mechanician holding on to the spare tire, the weight of the spare tire is pulling him out of the car, going around the corner. The driver's holding on to that spare tire too to keep his partner in the vehicle.
What can the winner of a Class A event down to a main event down between the normal night? What can they expect to
Top division is $1,400 to win now. There are some special races that pay more than that. It's about $1,400 to win. It's way too much.
Once again, I'd like to have a round of applause for Andy Cusack. Thanks to all of you for coming out today. A quick reminder at the back of the room at the table as you're exiting, we do have the membership raffle. Please